Hi, and welcome to Deep Leadership. I'm your host, John Rennie. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Matt Poepsel, a Marine Corps veteran, author, and leadership expert. In this episode, he shares how the military shaped his views on leadership, why today's workforce demands a new approach, and how leaders can balance mission and people in a world that's changing faster than ever. If you ever wondered how to inspire your team, earn their trust, and prepare for the future, this conversation is packed with insights that you don't want to miss. So, are you ready to dive in? Let's get started. Today, I'm joined by Matt Poepsel. Matt is a Marine Corps veteran and author of Expand the Circle, Enlightened Leadership for Our New World of Work. He serves as vice president and godfather of talent optimization at the Predictive Index. He holds a PhD in psychology, an MBA, and a Harvard Business School certificate of management excellence. And Matt is a part-time faculty member at Boston College, where he teaches in the areas of leadership, human resources, and business spirituality. He also hosts the popular Lead the People podcast, and I am excited to have him on the show to learn from his experience. So, Matt, welcome to the show.
John, thanks so much for having me. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's great to have you on the show. Great to have another veteran working on leadership and doing leadership stuff. So I'm excited to talk to you today just about your perspective. But first of all, tell us a little bit about your leadership journey. How have you gotten to this point, and why have you found yourself in the role of teaching and sharing leadership lessons?
Yeah, like you, I got my start, as you mentioned, in the military. I was in the U.S. Marine Corps for 6 years, which I really enjoyed. I was very proud to go in, and I was very pleased to get out. At that time, I knew I wanted to be a civilian after all that service. But I tell you, as somebody who really needed a lot of growing up in a hurry, they really straightened me out. And like I said, I needed it when that happened. But what I really kind of took for granted was how much they really invested in leadership. I mean, from the day that I showed up at boot camp, they shaved my head and they jammed a leadership book into my hands. And I was like, wow, I still got the haircut. I think I still have the book now that I think about it. But what happened after that is I went and I joined a startup in the software space. And I thought I knew all about leadership. I would just lead my people the way we did in the military. And boy, it did not work at all. It was just, you couldn't quite pull it off the same way. Civilian leadership is a lot different, as I learned. And, civilian organizations don't necessarily invest in leadership the same way that we experienced when we were in the military. So I kind of felt that I had to learn it on my own, really. I had a trunk full of audiobooks. That's how old I am, listening to audiobooks, trying to learn the ropes, and decided that I really enjoyed professional development to the point where I was going to study it formally, and ended up getting my PhD in psychology, as you mentioned, so I could study leadership and coaching at the highest levels, and just kind of carry that on through my executive career, and liked it so much that I decided to start teaching it and work as a thought leader and a speaker and all those fun things today. I just love sharing what I've learned about leadership and try to help some others who are coming up just as I did all that long time ago.
That's really neat. I mean, it's funny because we have similar backgrounds in that we started out from the military and we learned some lessons. As you mentioned, one of the things that leadership is like stressed in the military. And, the longer you serve, the more leadership responsibility you get. You start off as a doer and you end up becoming a leader, right? And over time that evolves. And as you mentioned, you're learning leadership at every stage. And what's interesting is that transition when you come into the civilian world. And like you, I saw there was a big gap missing. Like nobody trained in leadership and nobody was ready to lead when their time came. Where were some specific lessons that maybe you learned in the military that you still hold on to today, that are good, powerful lessons that still hold today?
I think the first is that leadership has to be studied. No one's born a perfect leader, and natural leaders, maybe some take to pieces of it better than others, but it's a craft that we have to study and we have to practice. And I think we spent a lot of time in a school circle learning all about leadership principles, but you had to try them. You had to actually do them. That was a big one. But the other thing that always stuck with me too, John, was they said mission accomplishment, troop welfare, in that order. That's how they would say it. And okay, those are two prime objectives. We get it. And I think those are still true, right? Leaders, if you can't put up the results, then you're not going to be much of a leader. But if you don't do it with and through your people, you're not much of a leader either. And I think sometimes we forget that last part. So I like to say that it's still those things, right? We have to get the work done, but we also have to get it done with and through our people. And now more than ever, those two things are really tied together. They're integrated in ways that we just hadn't seen before. So I really feel like the military service really helped me in that regard. But some things that it didn't prepare me for civilian leadership at all. One was that I just assumed that people were into their jobs.
Mm,
Everybody in the
yeah.
military, we knew why we were there. We were there for national security, defend the nation. That doesn't happen when you just work at a software company or a financial institution or a manufacturer or something like that. You have to manufacture that mission on your own.
Yeah.
That was a huge difference for me. And the fact that in boot camp, for example, you spend all the time with people. You can break them down and build them up and all these things, and you can't really have time to do those things in the civilian world quite the same. So some things carried over and translated and stuck with me to this day, and other things I had to kind of toss them out and find things that worked better.
I love that. You mentioned something that's really important. I talk about that all the time is the idea of mission and people. It's the and that connects them. So I think that sometimes we find leaders that are great on mission, right? But they destroy people and, lives and, and cultures along the way. And then we have others that are just people focused and everybody's happy and friendly, but they miss the targets, right? And so, the companies go under or they have to, close factories or what have you. But I think you nailed it right there. And I think that's something that stuck with me too from my military background is that and it's the mission and the people and it's in that order, right? And I think that's something that's always stood with me. And I think my first job, my first jobs in corporate, the mission was always unclear. And that's the thing that always bothered me the most. It's like I never could figure out like what are we here for? Like I hear one day we got to reduce scrap, we got to increase customer satisfaction, we got to reduce our warranty. Like what is the mission? It was confusing, and I think we weren't clear there. And I think that's one thing that really stood out was my job as a civilian leader was to try to make that mission clear, figure out a way, explain it to the people so they understand what the true mission is, because I think it's sometimes muddled in big companies.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of times, we can't be there with our people and make every decision for them. You wouldn't want to if you could. So you've got to give them that mission context because they're going to be operating ideally without your supervision 24/7. You want them to
Yeah.
make the right decisions. You want them to have the same sort of passion that you have for those collective objectives. And you say it very well when you say that leadership is a people business. That's right. You can't really separate the two anymore. And I say something very similar, which is that every business is a people business, whether you're in heavy industry or not, it doesn't really matter. Whoever makes the best use of their people and really inspires them toward this cause, the mission, as you say, that's who's going to have the competitive advantage. That's for sure.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. You kind of hint on something I would just ask you real quick. You're saying that I hear you say, and I know the reason one of the reasons you wrote the book was that there's kind of a change, a shift happening in the workplace, right? There's a need for a new era of leadership. Can you talk us through a little bit of like what's changed today where leaders have to really step up because the things have shifted?
Yeah, they really have. And I think that if you think back to a lot of the models that we use today, they're really dated from the Industrial Revolution. They're sorely out of date. And as we went through and evolved into a service economy, later to a knowledge economy, now we're hyper connected. What we really find is that work has gotten really complex and
Mm,
it's much more collaborative that's needed. We need agility. Well, if you want to be nimble and you want to be agile and you want to absorb change as fast as we need to today, you better have trust. You better have psychological safety. You better have teamwork. You better have all these human things because everybody has reasonable access to the same technology. In manufacturing, your equipment can be a little bit of a differentiator, but not for long. Pretty soon,
mm,
somebody's going to have the same equipment. So, how do you have your people, right? That's always going to be the biggest competitive differentiator that we have. Those who can mobilize their people toward that mission and can keep their retention high, can keep the learning cycles low and short, and all these things. So I really think that today more than ever, people are the engine of business.
mm.
And what we find is when we manage them with these outdated models, these very mechanistic views, then all of a sudden, a lot of people, especially early career people, post-pandemic workers, they're like, no, not going to put up with it.
Yeah,
Well, today, when the job market tightens up, they may not be able to just leave, even though they want to. But you know what they'll do? They'll clock off at 5 o'clock, not 5:01. They'll take that
mm,
discretionary effort and they'll be like, I'm going to do the minimum, not to get
yeah.
fired because I just don't feel like I'm cared for here. And meanwhile, somebody down the street who's getting people to really lean in, they're going to have that competitive advantage.
Yeah, I love that point because I think what I'm finding with younger people is they do want to be in the game. They want to be in the thick of things. Where I think, us being a little bit older, we sort of had to pay our dues and we knew we sort of did grunt work for years before we get that opportunity. But they want to come in and they want to contribute on day one. And if we don't give them that opportunity, like you say, they go find something else or they just, become apathetic, right?
Oh
So,
yeah.
but I think what I found at least is that if you can tap into that energy and that excitement and that desire to contribute, even if though they might not have the experience, they've got a lot of creativity, a lot of energy, and they still can help achieve the mission even without a lot of experience. So it's our job to pull that out of them, right?
Oh yeah, and the research shows that especially this newest generation, Gen Z, to enter the workforce, looking for unprecedented levels of autonomy and belonging, right? And having that type of an impact, and they're not getting it. And we sit there and we say, well, wait a second, we didn't have that when we came into the workforce. You're like, what are you talking, 20 years ago? What
Right.
about the workforce is still the same 20 years later? Not
Yeah.
much, right? And
Yeah.
so if you look at it at the surface, you're like, well, who wouldn't want those things, right? They live in a world that has only ever known technology and convenience and all of these types of things. Of course, that's what they want. And so
Yeah.
now it takes a very selfless leader to be able to say, my experience of what got me here, as a Gen X person, for example, is wholly irrelevant. What my job is to prepare these young leaders, even though it's their very first job, for what is coming in the next 20 years of their career, not my 20 years. Those days are gone, right? And so when you really see yourself as in charge of the mission and of, we won't say the troops, but let's say your people, then all of a sudden you look at it very, very differently. And the things that they ask for don't seem so, sort of out of left field, so to speak.
Yeah, I love that. And for those listening in, if you're doubting whether or not young people can do things, I just rebranded my company with 3 20-year-olds did the majority of the heavy lifting. And we just went to a trade show last week and just blew it out of the water and they did all the work. And how many 20-year-olds get to rebrand a company, right? And
Yeah.
so but their creativity, their energy, their passion, and I pretty much was just adult supervision, just kept I showed them where the pitfalls were, and they carried out all the work by themselves and they did it with autonomy and with energy. And it's like it was exciting to see young people and what they can do and what they can bring to organizations. So yeah, put your faith in some young people.
And I think what's different about that too, John, I'm sure you experienced this on submarines. I experienced it in the Marines too. You would have 18 to 20-year-old people making some multi-million dollar decisions.
Yes.
They're responsible for, incredibly high stakes. And there was an entire infrastructure in place to make sure that they could be successful. Well, now what we have is we have young people that have all that potential, but we don't necessarily have the infrastructure unless we're going to give them the autonomy, unless we're going to give them the coaching that they need, the sort of belonging that they're looking for. And so you can get those same results like you did if you give them that autonomy, you give them the support. You don't set them up to fail, but at the same time, you don't hold them back. That's something that we learned in the military was possible. And it's something else that translated for me. When I left the Marines and I went into the civilian world, I never would have let anybody tell me I wasn't a leader, even as an
Mm,
individual contributor. But I
yes.
see people today who've been in business 15 years and they're like, oh, I'm not a leader. I'm just a manager. Like, don't, leader sounds so, I wouldn't consider myself a leader. You're like, what? What are you talking about?
Yeah.
Like it's almost like so heavy. We've made people frightened of it. And in fact, Gen Z and some millennials are rejecting management roles at an alarming rate because they say it's so much more work and stress for not a lot more money. I'm just not going to do it. And I think, oh no, what a disaster, because some of my favorite moments of my entire professional life have come in leadership roles. And we're doing it so badly and supporting people so poorly, they don't even want to do it. This is going
Mm.
to significantly constrain our business growth, for decades to come.
Yeah, yeah. So what do when it comes to leadership development, you mentioned the dilemma, and I've seen that as well. Some of the you know, some of the Gen Zs I've dealt with that don't necessarily, or millennials more, that don't want to take responsibility in leadership positions because of that. I just want to be an individual contributor. I don't want to, it's too much work. How should leadership development sort of evolve now that we have this sort of it's a different workforce and much more engaged, much more technologically savvy,
Yeah.
much more. thinking about themselves than we did, as Gen Xers. So how should leadership development evolve?
Yeah, I think it's definitely a full contact sport, right? I think when
Yeah.
we start to remove some of the sensationalism of it and really say that leadership is about connection, it's about alignment, it's about fostering that mission orientation that we've been talking about. And recognize the fact that we need to support these leaders. I think that managers on average find leadership development to be incredibly ambiguous. What is it all about? If you go to Google search or talk to AI now, it's like, oh my gosh, it's even more confusing than when you started. Like
Yeah.
there's so much advice, but so little clarity about what you should actually be doing. So I think being able to create small group sessions to really talk about it, provide some light structure, have some level of development in sort of the infrastructure needed to be able to allow leadership development to happen, but also to recognize it. When people step up as leaders and they care for the career development of others, they're strengthening your company. When they
Mm.
are acting in a way that people feel good when they go home, that's strengthening your company too. So I feel like a lot of times we look at say, you're a manager now, but I'm just going to tell you what to do because I'm the executive and I'm not going to give you any room to make your own decisions. Like it's the worst of all worlds.
Mm.
But instead, when we provide the autonomy, we provide the recognition, and we allow them to develop by developing their people, then all of a sudden, I think it starts to turn the corner on that. And people will start to see leadership for what it is, which is a really noble thing when you do it right, because you're
Mm.
serving the company, you're serving the individual, and eventually there's enough left over that you can serve yourself too.
I love that. I love that. We talked about, leadership being a continuous, something you do throughout your life. You've had some different stages in your life. So what sparked the most recent stage of your leadership learning?
Yeah, I'm not that bright, John. So what happened is I had my midlife crisis. I turned 50 right in the middle of the global pandemic. Like terrible timing to go through all those things back in 2020. But the other thing that happened is my father was diagnosed with kidney cancer. And so he ended up going through a lengthy surgery and he's recovered now. He's enjoying his retirement. But at the time, it just really reminded me all of these things about our mortality, right?
Mm.
And it was one of these things where it caught my attention to the point where I realized I had fallen out of love with my work and with myself and everything else. And I felt like I was a little bit in free fall. And for a high performer, for decades, from military service, civilian world, PhD program, et cetera, I was flying high. And all of a sudden, I found myself just not knowing really even who I was.
Mm.
And so I landed on a meditation cushion of all places, and I started to really go deep into mind training and just mindfulness and these types of things. And I really started to recognize that I'm terrible at meditation. All I can think about is work. But what I started to recognize with some of these ancient sort of Eastern philosophies really have a lot of parallels to Western psychology of leadership. And so I started to recognize that we can look at leadership as something a little bit more selfless, a little more transcendent, and recognize that we can find our highest calling through our work if we're willing to take other people with us. So
Mm.
my call to serve my nation had eventually matriculated to my call to serve other people. And it was really, it unlocked some new doors and levels for me. And it was something that I desperately needed. And I started to look and gain a lot of new perspective in that way.
I love that you make that point. I tell, and listeners of the show have heard me talk about my 7 year journey when I got out of the military. I lost my North Star. I didn't know what I was put on earth to do. And I think that sometimes a lot of us find ourselves where we're like missing, like we lose the joy of work. We're not sure why we're doing, what we're doing. And I think for me, at least, it took a long time to figure that out as a, someone coming out of the military. But the other thing too is I think the mission changes over time. Like my mission, when I found my new mission, which was turn around struggling manufacturing businesses, that became my passion for my entire corporate career. And now it's evolved to I want to help develop new leaders. I want to teach the next generation of leaders. So for me, it was like the mission, which was similar to you, which was protect the country, right? Then it was like, now what do I do? And then it was like, okay, turn around struggling manufacturing businesses. Now it's pass on to the next generation. I think, don't you think there are stages in your life where you kind of refocus and say, what is it that I'm supposed to be doing? And
Yeah, I
and
think it's
and yeah.
very natural to do that. And like you said, when you lose that North Star, then you start to try to get some perspective taking. And if you allow yourself, then you really start to crystallize some things because your perspective broadens just maybe naturally as you get older, or if you really just practice at it, you become a lot less focused on your own self-interest and you start expanding that out and
Hmm.
start to look at the broader impact. So in your case about turning around a struggling manufacturer, all of a sudden, what happens? You start to turn around a manufacturer. Now, all of a sudden, people are feeling better at work. They're feeling less
Yeah.
anxious.
Yeah.
The levels of health and wellness goes up. You send them home better to their families and into their communities. You start to make sure that the business is performing better. And now all of a sudden your suppliers are getting paid on time. Imagine that. All these kinds of things. So there's this trickle down effect because everything's connected in ways that we can't really even appreciate or understand. But the fact is you're making these new ripples in this pond when you're turning around a manufacturer, and all of a sudden your life energy and your life force is going into now a business that has become a force for good. And now where
Hmm.
people used to regret or sort of have this terrible feeling when I got to go to work and that place is a disaster, but I haven't found another job yet. All that negativity, you reverse it. And now all of a sudden things start to happen. And it
Yeah.
takes time, but eventually when you start to create all that good impact, it's sort of like your connection and what you're putting out there really starts to take on an entirely new character.
Yeah, you feel like you're making a difference, and people, when people sort of get it and they get on board and they recognize that, oh, this is, we're in a unique time where we have a chance to turn this thing around. We have a
Yes.
leader that's, you know stuck the rudder in the water and steering us in a certain direction, for a change. Then, and they start getting on board, that's when it gets fun. That's when,
Yeah.
you build a team, and there's an energy, and there's like, you know people are pushing each other to get even better and to take the next steps. And I lived for for those moments when things just suddenly took a life of their own. That was always exciting when that happened, and it took a long while to turn the ship around. But once you started getting there and people started getting on board, it was so much fun. The energy was so great.
And I think that coming out of my experiences I did and really picking up my meditation practice and taking all that perspective, now I think every day I think two things. Number one is I think someday I'm going to die. And the
Mm.
second thing is today is not that day. And so while I'm still here, if I can breathe, I can
Yeah.
lead, right? And I
Yeah.
can have an impact positively on both the mission, yes, but also on the people who are pursuing that mission alongside me. And that has created for me a more selfless form of leadership. I'm not perfect at it. I don't get it right every time. Self-interest still sneaks its way in there. But when I'm at my best, I can turn down the volume on my own self-interest and recognize that nothing is bigger than the mission and the people who are pursuing that mission and their welfare. And all of a sudden, when you align all those things, magic things happen. You can turn around a
Yeah.
manufacturer, you can build a company, you can send people into their next leadership position, remembering what the impact you had on them. And all of
Yeah.
a sudden, all that sort of positivity is going to outlive me. That's for sure, right? It's
Yeah.
it's it's in the people who have been in my leadership followership, if you will, and that makes me happier than any sort of individual achievement I've ever had.
Hmm. Hmm. You teach at Boston College. I was just curious, how well are your students picking up on your enthusiasm and your energy towards leadership? How do you pass that on to those young people?
Yeah, it takes a little bit because you think you're taking just a regular old class. I teach self-awareness and I teach the future of work, which is part of an HR discipline over there too.
Yeah.
But I structure my classes so that they meet people where they are. So they're
Mm.
pretty, tactical, focused on the brass tacks of leadership as an example. But by the time we go through, in my case, a 14-week course, by the time we end with things around self-acceptance. We end with self-transcendence, right? These types of leadership at the selfless forms of it. And by then, they're really eating it up. So you have to take them on a journey, just like we're all on a journey, as you pointed out earlier. And I think that for an early career leader, being focused on sort of the fundamentals of leadership makes total sense. And I
Yeah.
think this is what removes the ambiguity, John. When you start to realize that leadership happens in stages and you have to constantly work on the stage you're at, appreciate that you've graduated from the prior stage, but that there's still a stage ahead of you. So I feel like there is a logical progression toward becoming this fully capacity, sort of self-aware and selfless form of leader. But it doesn't have to be the big mystery that it seems.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I know I teach at Thales College, and we one of the semesters we went through good to great, and we talk about level five leadership and how rare these level five leaders truly are. But the people that took these good companies and made them great were selfless leaders, and they weren't big on ego. They were about their team and building up their team to be able to achieve things that the company could never do before. But they're rare. Those people are rare, and so the leader that you just described is it's hard to achieve. It's even if you've been doing it as long as I have, you still find where you're fall short of being that high level of leader.
Yeah. And the reason that they're so rare is because fear is so plentiful. And
Mm,
whenever we experience fear, it drives us inward, drives up the volume on that self interest of ours. But if we can tame the fear through training or other techniques, then we can really emerge as the leaders that we have the capability to be. Because when you're not afraid, then what happens is you understand connection to the
mm.
mission, connection to one another, connection to your values, to your strengths. So if we can find a way to keep fear at bay, then it wouldn't be so rare to have these level five leaders. But instead, what you see is people who run massive companies in some cases are riddled with fear, and all that comes out is ego, and then they end up destroying value in the process. So let that serve as a warning to us to say you've got to do the inner work before you can have the outer impact. And that's how that really, starts to matriculate.
I love that you bring it up because I often saw in my, I did 22 years working for three global companies, and I said fear was the biggest cause of so many leadership problems. It was, fear of looking stupid, fear of losing my job, fear of missing the numbers for the quarter, fear of not getting my bonus. And they did so many dumb things because of fear. And so you just said something that's really powerful there is you've got to work on your inner self if you want to get your outer self right. And that's about, not focusing on that fear. And all those fears that I mentioned are ego. They're all like, I don't want to look stupid. I don't want to fail. I don't want to, right. And so I think you hit something that's really important. It's really something I've seen myself personally is that fear gets a lot of leaders in trouble.
Yes, absolutely. And I think the opposite of fear isn't courage, it's love. And this is something that it took me a long time to really appreciate. But when I was in the Marines, my very first formative experience, I'm on a six-person special forces team. We're sleeping in the woods. There's bad guys around. You feel a lot of love for one another. And
Mm,
so when you got into the civilian world, all that was gone. And now all of a sudden you don't even talk about it like a four-letter word. But when you start to recognize that when you move away from ego and all that fear, and you feel that connection and that goodwill and that wanting to support one another, all in line with the mission. We still have to run profitable businesses. Nobody's going to take that away from us. But I think doing it with and through other people from this position that is the opposite of fear, right? The opposite of ego, it is more collective, more selfless, and more about love. I think this is where you really start to see those level five leaders emerge. And it's possible for all of us. Will we get there? It depends on how much you want to face that fear.
yeah, I love that. You're not the first person to bring up love on this show, and it's very interesting because I feel that too. The tightness of our team on the submarine crew, because we lived in such close quarters, because we had this shared vulnerability that like we had to watch out for each other because not only were we worried about the Soviets, but we were worried about the sea pressure coming in. And so our job was keep the sea pressure out, and we had to be accountable to each other to make sure that didn't happen. And I think there was a high level of trust that we had with each other because our very lives were dependent on it. And you're right, we don't have that same level of like shared vulnerability that we had in the military. Like you talked about just being in the woods, that's shared vulnerability right there, right? You only had your five other brothers right there that had your
That's
back.
exactly right. Exactly
Yeah.
right. And when we think about young people entering the workforce, and now they're saying like we can see through the BS. Like we have our skepticism filters are on high alert all the time
Yes.
because we grew up on social media. And then they come to work and we pretend like nothing's wrong. Like, come on, that's not being real. That's not going to get you
Yeah.
trust. So instead, if like we could get real empathy and real care, always with mission orientation, we still got to we still got to turn around the manufacturer. We still got to run profitable business, but do it, with and through one another, back to back, like that's going to get you a lot farther. Those are the companies that are going to survive, in this
Yeah.
world that's changing faster than ever.
I love it. This has been fantastic. You've shared so much stuff and so much wisdom. What final message would you like to leave with our listeners today?
I think leadership is one of the most worthwhile and human things that we can do. I really want to turn around this notion that it's not worth it.
Mm.
That management positions, this leadership thing, it's the good stuff. It really is. But that leadership also is a craft that we have to study. It's a practice we have to undertake. It's a journey that we have to undertake, and we have to master it. It doesn't, you don't just get to be a level 5 leader, in Jim Collins' view. But it is possible for us, and it's very, very worthwhile.
I love that. Such powerful advice. I tell people that, leadership is like chess. You can sort of figure out the basics in a week, but it takes a lifetime to master. And I think that's exactly what you just said. It's a lifetime, it's a lifelong process. And if you're not still trying to get better in leadership, even though you've been doing it for 30 years, then you're missing out. It's a lifelong process. So I love that. Such great advice. This has been fantastic. How can our listeners find out more about you, your book, and your podcast called Lead the People?
Yeah, if you want to check me out, LinkedIn's great. And also mattpoepsel.com, my website. You can find all the things I'm working on. The book, Expand the Circle, is available on anywhere you get books. And yeah, the podcast is out there as well, Lead the People.
Well, very good. We're going to put links in the show notes for all of Matt's resources. And again, if something in this show really stood out and you had a question, please reach out to Matt. He's the expert. He's been doing this a long time, and he shared a lot of wisdom today in today's show. So I highly encourage you to reach out to him, pick up the book, Expand the Circle, and get on the podcast, Lead the People. I listened to his latest episode. It's fantastic. It's now I've subscribed because I'm going to listen to it. So I get to hear it every week. It's excellent. It's well done. And I highly encourage that as well. So, Matt, I want to thank you for coming on the show. Thanks for sharing your wisdom and the work that you're doing in leadership.
John, it's been an honor. Thanks again for having me.
Thank you again. Well, that is it for today. Thank you for listening to Deep Leadership. If you like this podcast, please subscribe and share so we can continue to build a world with better bosses. Until next time, this is John Rennie saying take care and lead well.